Thank you. Mr. President, State Minister Nafti of Tunisia, Foreign Minister Coveney of Ireland, Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia, Foreign Minister Ebrard of Mexico, Foreign Minister Eriksen Søreide of Norway, Deputy Foreign Minister Tamsar of Estonia, Foreign Minister Malki of the State of Palestine, Secretary-General Abul Gate of the Arab League, members of the Council. I am honored to address the Council for the first time in my capacity as the Secretary-General Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, and by the trust bestowed upon me in my role by the Secretary-General, the parties, and you, members of the Council. I thank the Palestinian and Israeli governments for their warm welcome and look forward to our initial meetings in the coming days and weeks. I wish to join the Secretary-General in welcoming the presidential decree issued by President Mahmoud Abbas to hold legislative, presidential, and Palestinian National Council election this year. The holding of election in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, will be a crucial step towards Palestinian unity, giving renewed legitimacy to national institutions, including a democratically elected parliament and government in Palestine. The United Nations stands ready to support efforts for the Palestinian people to exercise their democratic rights. Elections are a crucial part of building a democratic Palestinian state built on rule of law with equal rights for all. The forthcoming talks in Cairo to resolve outstanding issues related to holding of elections will be important for the planned preparatory process to move forward. Mr. President, the COVID-19 crisis continued to take a staggering toll across the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel. Concerted efforts to contain and halt the spread of the virus has succeeded in lowering the overall numbers of active cases in the West Bank and Gaza, but the cost in lives and livelihood remains high, particularly in the Gaza Strip. As a result of the ongoing spread of the pandemic, Israeli and Palestinian authorities extended and tightened movement restrictions in most areas during the reported period, significantly impacting daily life and limiting access to basic services. The UN and its partners continue to support the Palestinian government's efforts to control the COVID-19 pandemic through the delivery of personal protective equipment, oxygen therapy machines, testing materials, and other critical equipment. Through the efforts of the World Health Organization and UNICEF, the UN is also supporting the government's preparedness to receive and eventually administer vaccines. The Palestinian government is working to procure a supply of vaccines and anticipated support through the global COVAX AMX facility. The initial allocations of vaccines to cover priority groups are expected in the first half of 2021. At the same time, Israel has launched a large-scale vaccination campaign for its citizens and residents. In this context, the UN continues to encourage Israel to help address the priority needs of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory and to support COVID-19 vaccines availability more generally. This will be critical for the broader efforts of both governments to control the pandemic and is also in line with Israel's obligations under international law. Israel has worked closely with the UN and its partners throughout the course of the pandemic to ensure that equipment and supplies have been delivered throughout the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem and in Gaza. It is important that the same level of engagement and cooperation be sustained with regard to the delivery of vaccines. Mr. President, as noted in my opening remarks here today, President Abbas issued a long-anticipated presidential decree on 15 January stating that legislative, presidential, and Palestinian National Council elections would be held later this year. According to the decree, legislative elections will take place on the 22nd of May, followed by presidential election on 31 July and PNC elections on 31 August. I also note the amendment of the election law, raising the quota for female representation from 20 to 26%. I welcome this step and join the Secretary-General's call on Palestinian authorities to take further steps to facilitate, strengthen, and support women's political participation, including as voters and candidates throughout the election cycle. The UN has continued its engagement with the Palestinian Central Election Committee in support of free and fair election and stands ready to support the committee and Palestinian people as plans for elections progress. In a separate development in Israel, on 23 December 2020, the Israeli Knesset dissolved after failing to pass a budget, and general elections were scheduled for 23 March. Mr. President, in a concerning development, on 17 January, Israeli authorities advanced plan for some 800 housing units in Area C settlements. The following day, on 18 January, Israeli authorities published tender for some 1,900 units in Area C, an additional 210 units in East Jerusalem. Of the unit advanced and tendered, the majority are in settlements in outlying locations deep inside the occupied West Bank. Over 200 units are located in illegal outposts that Israeli authorities are retroactively regularizing under Israeli law. On 19 January, the Jerusalem District Court denied a request for an interim injunction to freeze the tendering process for some 1,200 units in Givat Hamatos. The bidding period for the tender closed on 18 January, and winning bids were announced on 20 January. I reiterate that settlements are illegal under international law and are a major obstacle to peace. They undermine the prospects for achieving a two-state solution. I urge the government of Israel to cease all settlement activity in the occupied territory, including in East Jerusalem. During the period, Israeli authorities demolished, seized, or forced owners to demolish 71 Palestinian-owned structures, including 19 residential structures, displacing 73 Palestinians, including 17 women and 37 children. The demolition and seizures were executed due to the lack of Israeli-issued building permits, which are nearly impossible for Palestinians to obtain. Israeli forces also bulldozed agricultural land and uprooted over 2,000 Palestinian-owned trees, claiming they were planted on state land. On 23 December, the Magistrate Court in Jerusalem ruled in favor of a settler organization upholding an eviction order against 4 Palestinian families in the Batan al-Haba section in the Silvan neighborhood in East Jerusalem. I urge Israel to cease demolition and seizure of Palestinian property in line with its obligation under international humanitarian law and allow Palestinians in Area C and East Jerusalem to develop their communities. Mr. President, violent incidents unfortunately continued throughout the reporting period. On 25 December, Palestinian militants in Gaza fired 2 rockets towards Israel, which were both intercepted by the Iron Dome system. On 26 December, Israeli Defense Forces retaliated against what is said were Hamas targets in Gaza. As a result, 3 Palestinian civilians were injured, including a 6-year-old girl, and damage was caused to civilian structures. On 18 and 19 January, 3 additional rockets were fired from Gaza towards Israel, with 2 landing in the sea off Israel's southern coast, and 1 reportedly landing in an open field, causing no damage or injuries. The IDF retaliated by striking what is said were Hamas targets in the Strip, with no injuries reported. On 23 January, an explosion reportedly caused by material stores in a house in Beit Hanun resulted in injury of 47 people, including 19 children and 15 women. Turning to the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, 2 Palestinians, including 1 child, were killed after reportedly carrying out attacks against Israelis, and 63 Palestinians were injured, including 2 children and 2 women in clashes, attacks, search and arrest operations, and other incidents. 8 Israelis, including 2 soldiers, 2 women, and 1 child, were injured by Palestinians during the reporting period. On 21 December, a 52-year-old Israeli woman was found killed in a forest near the settlement of Tal Menashe in the occupied West Bank, having been attacked with a stone. On 24 December, Israeli forces arrested a Palestinian man in the village of Turah near Jenin on suspicion of the killings in a premeditated attack. According to Israeli authorities, he subsequently confessed to the killing. 4 other Palestinian men were also arrested in the connection with the killing. On 24 December, a 17-year-old Palestinian opened fire at an Israeli police post in the old city of Jerusalem and was subsequently shot and killed by Israeli security forces. On January 1, a Palestinian man was left paralyzed after being shot by live ammunition by Israeli forces in the Al-Raqiz community in the southern West Bank during a dispute between Palestinians and Israeli forces over the seizure of an electricity generator. An initial Israeli Defense Forces internal probe found that the shooting was accidental and happened in circumstances where soldiers feared for their lives. An account disputed by Palestinian eyewitnesses. The IDF opened a further inquiry into the incident. On 5 January, a Palestinian man was shot dead by ISF at the Gush Etzion junction in the West Bank after allegedly attempting to carry out a stabbing attack. The man's body is being withheld by the Israeli authorities. Mr. President, I reiterate that Israeli security forces must exercise maximum restraint and may use lethal force only when strictly unavoidable in order to protect life. Particular care should be taken to protect children from any form of violence. Furthermore, the indiscriminate launching of rockets towards Israeli population centers violates international law and must stop immediately. There can be no justification for attacks against civilians. Mr. President, there was an increase in settler-related violence throughout the reporting period. This increase took place in the aftermath of the death of a 16-year-old boy from the settlement of Bat Ayin while being seized by Israeli police and on suspicion of throwing stones at Palestinians. Israeli settlers and others injured Palestinians or reportedly damaged their property, resulting in 22 injuries and damage to property, in two separate incidences in East Jerusalem and Al-Luban at Sarkia. Near Nablus, a boy and a man were physically assaulted and injured. Meanwhile, Palestinians perpetrated some 55 attacks against Israeli settlers and other civilians in the West Bank, resulting in 6 injuries and damage to property. On 3 January, a woman was critically injured by a thrown rock while driving near Deir Nidam, close to Kalkilia. All perpetrators of violence must be held accountable. Mr. President, on 23 December, the envoys of the Middle East Quartet met virtually to discuss the prospect of Israeli-Palestinian peace and the latest developments on the ground. I look forward to engage with my counterparts as soon as at all possible to identify concrete steps to bring the parties back to the path of meaningful negotiations. On 11 January, the foreign ministers of Egypt, France, Germany, and Jordan met in Cairo to discuss ways to advance the Middle East peace process. In the joint statement following the meeting, the ministers emphasized their support for the two-state solution based on the 1967 lines, UN resolutions, and international law, rejected unilateral steps, and urged all parties, including the Quartet, to take steps towards launching negotiations. Mr. President, briefly turning to the region. On the Golan, the ceasefire between Israel and Syria has been generally maintained, despite the continued violation of the 1974 disengagement of force agreement by the parties, leading to increased tensions. There was also reports of airstrikes attributed to Israel on locations in Syria on 25 and 30 December and 6, 13, and 22nd of January, resulting in casualties. On 6 January, UNDOF personnel observed kinetic activities in the UNDOF area of operations, involving the firing of anti-aircraft tracers around from the northeast across the area of separation, and 2 of them exploding midair. UNDOF personnel heard aircraft activity on the Alpha side and explosions on the Bravo side. UNDOF continues to liaise with both parties to remind them on their obligations to respect the terms of the disengagement agreement and prevent escalation of the situation across the ceasefire line. In Lebanon, consultations to form a government continue. Participants of the 2 December Paris conference, co-chaired by UN and France, expressed support for the Lebanese people and took stock of the response to the 4 August Beirut port explosion. Participants expressed concern about the political deadlock and worsening socio-economic situation. While the situation in the UNIFIL area operations was generally stable, tensions remain high. There were increased violations of Lebanese airspace by Israeli and incidents of weapons pointing between Israeli defense forces and Lebanese armed forces across the blue line. Mr. President, as we contend with one urgent crisis after another, we must not lose sight of our overarching goal: supporting Palestinians and Israelis to resolve the conflict and end the occupation and achieve the vision of two-state living side by side in peace and security, based on the 1967 lines, UN resolutions, and international law. A solution that reflects that both peoples have an undeniable historic bond with this place, that its holy sites are deeply important to 3 world religions, and that both people have a right to live on it independently and as free people. Mr. President, despite the significant challenges, achieving the outcome remains possible. And there are opportunities unique to this moment that should not be missed. I joined the Secretary-General in welcoming the agreement signed between Israel and United Arab Emirates. I hope that the promise of the recent agreements made between Israel and Arab countries will lead to a situation where a more peaceful Middle East can be realized. However, it requires leaders on all sides to re-engage meaningfully and return to the path of negotiations. I look forward to working with Palestinians, Israelis, and Quartet partners, along with Egypt, Jordan, and other regional and international stakeholders, to ensure that we create and preserve the necessary conditions for progress. In this context, allow me to reiterate that the financial situation of UNRWA remains a serious concern. The agency is not only a lifeline for millions of Palestinian refugees, but is also critical to regional stability. I renew the Secretary-General's appeal for support. Mr. President, at the end, I resume this role with deep appreciations for the crucial work that has been carried out every day by United Nations personnel on the ground, and I look forward to working with the Deputy Special Coordinator, Lynn Hastings, and together with the entire UN family to support the peace process and redouble our collective efforts to supporting strengthening of institutions of the Palestinian Authority in line with our respective mandates. I wish to acknowledge and thank my predecessor for his perseverance and his role and his friendship to me personally, both now and in my previous capacity. Nikolai Mladenov's performance as special coordinator is a hard act to follow. I intend to continue Nikolai's effort to speak openly and frankly with all sides. I will support and encourage Israelis and Palestinians in pursuit of peace, urge them to refrain from damaging unilateral steps, and help to create an environment conducive to dialogue. I humbly request your support for this effort. Thank you.